All right, and we're also recording in the room. So the idea is we want to make this a resource that people can go and watch after. So just so you're aware about that. In addition, we would welcome your questions and comments in the Zoom chat as the meeting is going on. We're going to try to tackle the questions as they come up if they're relevant to what we're presenting. But if there's something that we can't answer in the moment, we'll do that during the Q&A session at the end. And then also, if you want to ask a question, you can use the Q&A feature. You can see the button right there in Zoom. Of course, anyone in the room can just raise their hand and we'll just go from there. So we have a lot to cover, and including an amazing introduction to our amazing panel. I just want to give a really brief some context to the presentation on the specialized code. So at a broad level, it's clear that our buildings play a critical role in the efficiency, sustainability, and resilience of our community. They have a major impact on our emissions. In 2022, the City Council adopted essentially a target to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. And this is in alignment with the Commonwealth's goals. That's guiding a lot of the development of different laws and regulations. And so, for us, we really wanted to, make sure that we're meeting, this target. So to help us understand our path to achieving this goal, we recently completed an emissions inventory of our community that shows about 60% of emissions come from building energy consumption. And within this, 74% of emissions come from oil and natural gas. Reaching net zero emissions is going to require a lot of significant changes in our existing building stock. This will mean things like comprehensive insulation and weatherization upgrades, HVAC retrofits, widespread electrification. And whether it's through our own municipal building projects or throughout the community, we know how difficult that can be. Just we see how complex, disruptive, and costly it can be to retrofit buildings to try to meet these standards. So while we have to tackle that challenge, I think some important context from my perspective is that building energy code can help ensure that we're moving in the right direction with our new construction. We're building towards a net zero future. So improvements in this area not only make our buildings more efficient and less costly to operate, but also healthier with improved indoor air quality and enhanced resilience. So tonight we'll be focusing on the Specialized Opt-in Energy Code, a new energy code option developed in 2022 as a result of the Massachusetts Decarbonization Roadmap Act. It's being explored for adoption in Framingham. The Specialized Code builds upon the Stretch Energy Code, which was adopted in Framingham in 2014. The Specialized Code prioritizes deep energy efficiency, reduced heating loads, and efficient electrification for new construction. Since its development in 2022, it's been adopted by communities such as Natick, Ashland, Sherborne, Wayland, and Worcester. And Dylan's going to go into some more detail about that as well. And so, to help us dive into the Specialized Code and related topics, we have an amazing panel with us today. Some brief introductions. So if everyone, as I introduce, could just say hi or unmute and say hi. I'm going to start with our Director of Inspectional Services and Building Commissioner, Fred Bray.
Good evening, everyone.
Thanks, Fred. And then, of course, myself. I'm the Sustainability Coordinator for the city. I'm going to turn it over to Dylan, who's also in the room.
Hello.
He's the Green Communities Coordinator, who helps us on a lot of stuff, including our annual reporting, which is due in a week or 2 weeks. And then we have Becca Edson, also from the Department of Energy Resources. She's an architect there.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
We have Michael Rossi from PSD.
Hi, everyone.
We have Hank Keating, who is the president of Passive House, Massachusetts, and former project architect at Trinity Financial.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you, Hank. And of course, Nick Falkoff, owner of Auburndale Builders and the founder of the Studio for High Performance Design and Construction.
Hello, thanks for having me, Sean.
Thanks, Nick. With that said, just going to highlight tonight's agenda. So we're going to start off on a presentation on the Specialized Opt-in Code and what the differences are compared to the Stretch Code. Then we'll talk about Passive House, a building standard within the Specialized Code and also in the Stretch Code. But specifically, we're going to be highlighting, multifamily in that as well. And then we'll get into a presentation on high performance homes in Massachusetts and building to HERS 42/45. And then we'll end with a Q&A session. So with that said, I'm going to turn it over to Dylan Patel from DOER to do the first segment.
All right, good evening, everyone. Thank you. So, as Sean was saying, my name is Dylan Patel. I am the regional coordinator under the Green Communities Division for the Northeast region, serving the great towns in the Northeast, as well as some great cities, including Framingham. So I'm going to present. There we go. I'm going to present a little bit more on the context and provide a little bit more of the policy background on the specialized code before I turn it over to Michael Rossi. There we go. So to kind of lay the groundwork here, the specialized stretch code kind of came into fruition 3 years ago under the Climate Act that was passed by the Baker administration in 2021. The Climate Act was quite a wide-ranging piece of legislation, but for the purposes of tonight, it did two main things. Number one, it set greenhouse gas emissions goals for the state of Massachusetts to achieve net zero emissions by 2050 with interim targets for the decades prior. And then it also kind of shifted authority for developing the stretch code from the BBRS, the Boards of Building Regulations and Standards, to DOER. And in doing so, it also tasked with DOER to develop this new stretch code that would align construction toward the goals of net zero emissions by 2050. And we have a lot of levers when it comes to achieving net zero emissions by 2050. Obviously, it is an extremely daunting task. And there are many ways to kind of slice that cheese. The big thing that the Energy Code does is that it impacts, especially with the specialized stretch code, and you'll hear this repeated over and over again throughout tonight, it kind of targets new buildings for two reasons. One is that within the state, we are predicting a large growth in the housing stock for the decades to come, upwards of more than a quarter of the building stock that's going to exist by 2050 will be new build constructions. And it's a lot easier to make those new buildings net zero compliant or 2050 compliant than it is for existing buildings. And then as we kind of develop this new market, this new learning by doing, when it comes to things like achieving HERS 42, achieving passive house certification, it will create these new secondary markets, both in terms of technology, in practical learning by doing for these existing buildings. And with the specialized energy code and also with the stretch energy code, we're really leveraging and taking advantage of what's kind of going on with the grid. So right now, the electricity sector within the state is fairly gas dominated. And that kind of means that we have quite a high emissions factor in this state. And that kind of means that when you're heating by electricity, especially with most currently heating technology with electric resistance buildings or buildings heated with electric resistance, it's actually very greenhouse gas intensive, even more so than actually heating directly with any kind of fossil fuel equipment. However, especially like in the past 5 years, past decade, there's been enormous growth and an enormous improvement in the models of heat pumps coming out, not just air source heat pumps, but also ground source heat pumps. And as you are all aware, with network geothermal, that's going to be a lot more prominent in the coming decades. Despite the fact that we have a pretty emissions heavy grid right now, these heat pumps are able to heat and cool buildings with such a great efficiency that right now they are less emissions intensive than just heating with gas. And we can kind of accelerate that, that margin, especially when we get to 2050, because we're expecting a lot more deployment of renewable energy, a lot of solar, a lot of onshore wind, a lot of offshore wind, contracts for hydropower in Canada, nuclear in the other New England states. That's going to drive down our grid emissions factors, so much so that even if you're heating by electric resistance by 2050, which God, I hope you're not, you're actually having a lot less impact on greenhouse gas emissions compared to heating with natural gas. And when you're heating with heat pumps, your emissions are pretty much negligible. So that's really what we want to take advantage of when we're designing these new codes. So Sean kind of introduced this idea earlier, and I just want to kind of contextualize what the specialized code is in relation to the other codes before Michael goes into a bit more of a deeper dive. So as you all know, Framingham has been a stretch code community for many years at this point. It is one of 254 municipalities across the state. The vast majority of those are green communities. And the specialized code kind of exists as the top of this kind of code pyramid, if you will. And it exists pretty much, and especially in the legal text, as the stretch code plus an appendix, plus some additions. And so far, we've had 47 adoptees to the code and counting. And just to give you an idea, this code has only been available for adoption since January of 2023. So in about 20 months, we've already had 47 municipalities adopt the specialized code. And to kind of provide a little bit more detail on the policy, the specialized stretch code is one of the criteria of a new grant program that DOER and especially the Green Communities Division is launching. It's called Climate Leaders. This Climate Leaders program is going to provide substantial grant funding for municipal renewable energy, outreach, as well as greater electrification and decarbonization technologies for municipal buildings. And the specialized stretch code adoption is one of those criteria. And Framingham is on its way to meeting several others as well. And I'll say that Framingham is also well positioned to be taking advantage of the Climate Leaders Grant Program, considering the fact that it has already received more than $1 million, 1.2 million in Green Communities funding, both in terms of its designated funding as well as its competitive grants. There we go. And as Sean was alluding to earlier, a lot of Framingham's neighbors have also adopted the specialized stretch code. This includes Sherburne, Wayland, Natick. The town of Sudbury is considering it sometime next year. But as you'll see from the map, there is now a much greater geographic dispersal of the adoption of the specialized stretch code, both in Western Mass and the Cape and Islands. And we're seeing a lot of different municipalities of different kind of urban densities and income levels also adopt the specialized stretch code. So this is not something that's really restricted to the Boston metro area. This is really something that's spreading far and wide across the state. So I'm going to turn it over to Michael Rossi for a bit of a deeper dive onto the specialized energy code. It's just the button, and you just got to press it hard.
Great. Yeah, thanks so much, Dylan. So my name is Michael Rossi. I'm an energy code specialist at Performance Systems Development, or PSD. We provide energy code training and technical support to code officials and others across Massachusetts on some of the provisions of both the stretch code and the municipal opt-in specialized code. So just before I start, I want to say I'm going to be referring to the code in a few different ways potentially throughout the night. You might hear it. I might be calling it the opt-in code, the specialized code, but just know that these terms are interchangeable. So both mean the same thing. And essentially what it is a second level above the stretch code. So first I want to just bring forth some fast facts about the code. So so essentially it only applies to new construction. There's no impact on the specialized code for existing buildings. So only new buildings are going to be impacted by the code requirements. There are also no additional requirements for the specialized code if you're going to build a new all-electric home. Those are the same requirements as it would be under the stretch code. So there's nothing new that you would have to do if that's the case. And then additionally, it retains the choice to build with natural gas. So you're not so there is still an option to build with natural gas. There are just a couple additional requirements you have to meet if you choose to do so. And then there are some requirements in the stretch code for electric vehicle charging, but the specialized code does not add any new or additional requirements that are there. So the EV requirements are the same as they would be under the stretch code. So that is just some things we typically hear when in these presentations. So big things are it applies only to new construction, and there's no additional requirements if it's all electric. So the basis of both these stretch code and the specialized code, something called a HERS rating or HERS index. HERS stands for Home Energy Rating System, and essentially it's a third-party certification system that's developed through the Residential Energy Services Network, or ResNet. So a HERS is essentially an energy model that takes into consideration a lot of different aspects of the home, such as the insulation, mechanical systems used, the size, equipment, appliances, all of that, and essentially generates this, it's similar to like a miles per gallon sticker for a car, but for a house. So a typical home in Massachusetts that's older is around a HERS 170. A new home that was constructed in 2006 is equivalent to a HERS 100. In 2020 and 2021, the average HERS score in Massachusetts is a 51. And I should say the lower the score, the more energy efficient it is. And a zero energy home is essentially a HERS 0 or below, because you can go below that. So I will note that the requirements for the HERS rating are equivalent to those that are found in the stretch code. So there aren't any differences to the HERS score between the stretch code and the specialized code. So now we're going to break down some of the specifics about what's different between the different code versions and talk about some of the specific provisions. So if it's an all-electric new home of any building of any size, again, the requirements are the same as they would be under the stretch code. It has to be either a HERS 45 or Passive House certification. There's two aspects of certification that I'm sure Hank will talk about in a little bit more detail later in the presentation. There's the US model, which is called FIAS, and there's the European model, which is PHI, or Passive House Institute. So essentially, it's similar to HERS. It's also a third-party certification system, but I'll let those that are the experts talk about that later on. And then when you're building a new mixed fuel building, if it's under 4,000 square feet, the HERS requirement under the stretch code is a 42. But for the specialized code, there's two additional requirements you have to meet. There's a inclusion of a solar photovoltaic system with a minimum kilowatt array of 4, and also wiring for future electrification. And what that means is any equipment that's currently using fossil fuels for space heating, water heating, cooking, and clothes drying have to have an outlet nearby for the future use of electric equipment if you are to replace it. And then, so that's what the requirement is if it's under 4,000 square feet. If you build a new home that's over 4,000 square feet, which are typically larger luxury homes, the requirement, if you are going to go mixed fuel, is for the mixed fuel pathway isn't actually available. So the requirement is that zero energy pathway under the specialized code, which requires enough solar PV to get to a HERS 0 or FIAS 0 certification. So as well as that wiring requirement for electrification. So essentially, it has to be a score prior to factoring in on-site power and then a score after factoring in on-site power. And we'll talk a little bit more about what gets you there in a moment. It is really project specific in a way where the size you'll need to get to zero really depends on the home that you're building. And then for the passive house option, that's still available for any pathway or any size. But there is an additional requirement under the specialized code for it to be wired for electrification if you're using mixed fuel in the passive house structure. And then looking at homes, additions, and alterations, as we noted previously, the requirements are the same as they would be under the stretch code. There's nothing new you have to do for that as part of the specialized code. And then for historic homes, there is an exemption if it would distort, if the code, or if meeting the energy code requirements would damage or threaten the historic fabric or form or function of the building. So those are the main differences on the residential side. So here's a little bit more about the solar PV requirements. So I will say that there's essentially the mixed fuel is required to have solar of about a 300 square feet size and oriented correctly. So that's essentially oriented between 270 and 110 and 270 degrees of true north, where the system will be most effective. So that's the outline of what the orientation of the home has to be in that in order to require solar. Additionally, the code does not require trees to be cut down just to meet these requirements. And the code describes it as shaded more than 70% of daylight hours annually. So if it's demonstrated that the site is shaded ahead of time, the solar requirements are not applicable. So as I noted, if you're building a new all-electric home, solar is not required. If you're building passive house, solar is not required. If you're building a mixed fuel home that's under 4,000 square feet, you have to have at least a 4 kilowatt array. If it's over 4,000 square feet, which again are those larger homes, you have to have enough to get to net zero, which again is project dependent, but might look like potentially 8 kilowatts or higher for the size array. And then for other residential buildings like 3-story low-rise multifamily buildings, the requirement is 0.75 watts per square feet, which is identical to the requirements that are found in the commercial portion of the code. All right, so I will say there are a lot of really great incentives out there available to help meet some of the requirements here, just to make some of the upgrades that you're going to have to meet or make to meet this code more feasible. So I will note that Mass Save incentives are subject to change, and they are in the process of developing a new 3-year plan. So we'll see what the incentives look like moving forward. But as of now, what's available for single-family incentives, there's up to $15,000 for HERS if you achieve a HERS 46 or below, which, as you know, is the same as what would be required under the code. And then for another single-family incentive for passive house is a $25,000 incentives. And there are adders for certain technology upgrades as well. So if you're using an induction stove for cooking or a heat pump water heater for water heating, there are potential adders to the amount of incentives available as part of this new structure. And those are just some of the incentives in Mass. There are also some really great federal incentives available through the 45L tax credit, such as $2,500 if the home's built to Energy Star, as well as $5,000 incentive if it's a DOE zero net energy ready home and meets that program requirements. And then additionally, there are some incentives available for solar as well, including a 30% federal tax credit that is extended through 2032. As well as a 15% state level tax credit that's capped at $1,000. There are also some incentives available through both net metering and SMART programs. So that's just a quick snapshot of some of the single family incentives out there to help support the energy code. There are some additional incentives for multifamily that are on this slide, but we're not going to talk about in too much detail. So looking at some of the multifamily specific requirements for new multifamily buildings that are over 4 stories and over 12,000 square feet of living space, the stretch code requirements are, you have 3 different paths for compliance under the stretch code. There's the HERS 45 pathway we talked about. There's the passive house pathway, which we briefly mentioned, and we'll talk about in more detail soon, as well as this other pathway called thermal energy demand intensity, or TEDI. So those are the 3 pathways that are available under the stretch code for multifamily buildings, but that actually changes under the specialized code to the requirement for passive house. So all electric homes have to be certified under passive house. That HERS pathway and the TEDI pathway are no longer applicable. And for mixed fuel homes, the requirement is still passive house, but there is that additional wiring requirement for electrification that we talked about earlier. That's on top of that. So again, if you're building a passive house with mixed fuel, it still has to have that wiring requirement in place similarly to the stretch code, or similar to the requirements for the HERS. And then my last slide before I turn it over to Hank is just a similar information to what I just said, just described in a different way. So for all electric buildings, the requirement and the pathway that's available under the code is passive house. And for mixed fuel buildings, it's passive house plus that electrification ready requirement that we just talked about. And what passive house means, I'm sure Hank will get to in just a moment. So thank you all.
Okay, thank you, Mike.
Yep.
Pass
Can
it
you
off to
hear
Hank.
me? Yeah.
We can.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm the president of Passive House Massachusetts. I've been in this role for close to 10 years after I retired as an affordable housing developer. And I've essentially devoted those 10 years to advocacy for Passive House in codes and incentives and developing training programs for them. I'm going to go through my slides quickly and be available to answer questions. Next slide, please. Let's skip that one, yeah. So this we can skip also because Michael's just really covered this. Stretch code is what you're working with now. All right, so what is a passive house? Passive House is a third-party building verification program with two options for certification. The Passive House Institute US and the PHI, which is the Passive House Institute International, which is European-based. The certifications standards set energy performance and building envelope airtightness requirements, minimums that have to be met through a computer modeling program. And so how do passive house buildings perform? When you meet the metrics of these two systems, heating loads can be reduced by up to 90% or more compared to a typical cold building, and overall energy demand can be reduced by 60% or more. So these are remarkably energy efficient buildings. It's a quantum leap over code. Next slide. So any type of building can meet the passive house building standards. Here we are. Any type of building can meet them. So I raise this because the term house is in the name, most people think, well, it's only for housing. It's not. That's where we've seen the major pickup of the technology in this state. But you can see here a school in Beverly, a single family home in Cambridge, and this is the largest high-rise office building in the world, recently achieved certification in downtown Boston. So it's any type of building. Next slide. I'm not going to go through this in great detail, but the features of passive house buildings are building science based. It starts with the building envelope, and the things that are required are continuous thermal insulation, airtight building envelope, thermal bridge mitigation, which we can get into if people have questions, high performance windows and doors that reduce radiant cooling for resident comfort, and optimized solar heat gain is important for smaller buildings, single family homes. It's surprising how little that is of significance on large multifamily buildings. Mechanical systems typically have balanced and continuous ventilation with heat recovery, and that the reduced load on the building allows for efficient and minimized heating and cooling systems. We like to say that if we put the money into the cheap products like insulation, we can reduce the amount of money we have to put into the systems by downsizing them. And then efficient water and heating and distribution. Next slide. Passive house buildings have many benefits from the building envelope. No, let's Go to the next slide. Yes. Benefits. So the financial benefits for a passive house are predictable, stable, and reduced energy costs. We're going to do a model. We're going to determine that the building's meeting that model, and it's going to have dramatically reduced energy costs. As we said just a moment ago, that results in smaller and more efficient equipment, and you've in the end produced a higher quality, more valuable asset. This is a building with better durability in its envelope, and it's a building that's not going to require to be retrofit 10 years from now as the state codes tighten up further. Health and comfort benefits are sometimes overlooked, but it's obvious we have improved indoor air quality with the 24/7 balanced ventilation to all the spaces in the unit. Reduced air drafts and consistent temperatures, quieter acoustics, they're remarkably quiet buildings. And finally, not on this list, but important is the ability to shelter in place during a power outage. Much extended ability to shelter in place. The environmental benefits obviously include reduced carbon emissions, climate resilient buildings that won't require retrofits, and Passive House is the perfect platform for full electrification and net zero buildings. If you're going to aim for electrification and net zero, you should start with the most energy efficient shell that you can, and that's Passive House. Next slide. So how do you design a Passive House? The architects and engineers must work with a certified Passive House consultant to design the low energy project. And during that initial process, the consultant is helping the team develop the approach to the building, but the early designs are submitted to the certifying agency, whether it's PHI or FIAS, and they go through early review to make sure that they're on track for certification. Then contractors are supported by Passive House raters and verifiers who inspect, test, and verify during the field construction. So overall, the building owner is following a two-step certification process, one before construction with all of the submissions to the certifying agencies before construction begins, and then after construction showing the modeling and design submissions and all the inspection reports. So QA/QC is an incredibly important aspect of Passive House to make sure we get these buildings built properly. Next slide. Even before this opt-in specialized code has been adopted by 47 communities, which has just happened in this year, even before that, the existing incentive programs through MassSave have produced a waiting list or a registration list of over 15,000 multi-housing projects across the state. You can literally look at this slide and say, back in 2021, we literally had under 100 units of Passive House in the state of Mass. This is projecting construction completion of the units that have been opting to be involved with the MassSave program. Next slide. Before that program was even designed, the specifics of the incentive program, Passive House Massachusetts got together with the Mass Clean Energy Center and worked on this Passive House Design Challenge. Because the biggest question was, what does it cost to do multifamily Passive House? The challenge was to demonstrate that you could do it for under 4%. These are the 6 projects that competed and were granted money to take on the challenge. And you can see that it was a major success. I mean, most of them are under 2. We have one at 3.5 and one at 4.1 didn't quite make it. The important thing to focus on with these buildings is that they were designed 7 years ago. They were built 5 years ago. And that the education of the design and construction community in that intervening years is tremendous, and we can essentially guarantee that these projects with the right building team and the right training can do multifamily projects for less than 3%. Next slide, please. And we'll go to, yeah. So I often hear people say, well, isn't this going to be very hard and expensive on affordable housing? The fact is that affordable housing has been leading the way because DHCD, which it was then, which is now EOLHLC,
HLV.
yeah, a very, very awkward acronym. They give extra consideration to passive house projects through their funding program, through the qualified allocation plan. They award bonus points. All low-income housing tax credit funding is so competitive that it's almost compulsive for a project to, or compulsory for a project to go after those bonus points. We're at a point where over half of them in every funding round propose that, and the other half have other built-in priorities they can use instead of passive house. So if you don't have a specific way to get funded, you need to go after passive house for a low-income housing project. Next slide. So this is the multifamily project incentive program. Michael went through this. I'm going to go through it in a little more detail because I think they did a great job designing this. A project team can get $5,000 up front for registering. So when we say we have 15,000 registered, that's not necessarily the number that they're going to follow through. But they get $5,000 for a feasibility study. At that point, they can decide whether they want to move on or not. The next step is to do an energy modeling exercise that they can get up to $20,000 maximum for. If that energy modeling shows they can achieve pre-certification, they can get another $500 per unit. And then upon final certification of completion of construction, they can get the final $2,500. So there's well over $3,000 worth of incentive available per unit for multifamily housing. Next slide. This I will only touch on very briefly because Michael touched upon it. The interesting thing is that if you look at the form here, a level 2 home has to get a HERS score of 35. It doesn't have to be passive house, but if it's getting a score of 35, that's what passive houses will be getting. So effectively, you can look upon these level 2 incentives as straightforward incentives for passive house because you're going to definitely be hitting those HERS scores. Okay, next slide. So with all of the projects that are going to be moving forward with passive house, it's critical that we have passive house training. The Mass Save, when they put in the passive house incentive program, they effectively went ahead through ICF and contracted with Passive House Mass to do passive house trainings. We've done thousands of hours of training over the last 5 years, including no-cost lunch and learns, workshops, and 50% reimbursement available for professional certification. If somebody wants to become a certified passive house consultant, they can take the course and get a 50% reimbursement through the program. There are many other agencies and organizations providing training, including Studio for Performance Design and Construction. Nick is here and he will be speaking after me. But beyond that, we've got NESI, we've got BE+, we have BSA, we've got the Northeast HERS Alliance, and the Builders and Remodelers Association, all of which are helping to take part in the training needed. Next slide. So I'll end with the training opportunities that we make available. In addition to what we do through the Mass Save program, we have an on-demand training library of recorded content. You can go on our website and you can be there for days going through content on training. We do monthly presentations, and this month, in November 12th, we have a session with raters and verifiers talking about their experience with Passive House. We have an annual conference, our symposium, this year, December 10th. You should look at that and consider attending. And then we maintain professional directory and resources and fact sheets. So take a look at our website, take advantage of the resources we have. We're on the verge of a 3-year program of really upping the game for Passive House training. So that's going to really be kicking off in the first quarter of next year. Thank you.
Thank you, Hank. And let's move on to our final presentation for the night. I'm going to turn it over to Nick. And you should be good to go, Nick.
Okay. Thanks for having me, Sean, and thanks, Hank. And Hank's celebrating 10 years of Passive House Mass. I've learned a lot from Hank. So a brief intro to Auburndale Builders. So my company, we did remodeling for about 14 years before we started building new. We did our first house in 2016, and then that led to our first net positive house in 2017, and then a net zero remodel in 2018. And we've done over 30 all electric projects in the past 8 years. And these are a mix of new construction and remodels. So mostly all on the residential side, a couple of commercial mixed in there, mostly residential single family. And we're currently teaching high performance building for carpenters through our nonprofit that we had started, Studio HPDC. And so I'll talk a little bit about that. Next slide, please. So in our journey towards learning high performance, we worked with, this is one of our first net zero homes. We worked with Stephanie Horwitz from Zero Energy Design. And so we had the sort of good fortune to sort of get in with the architects who were already practicing this pretty early on, early adopters. And so we were able to learn from really experienced designers. And that's sort of, we've been taking that experience of us having the benefit of great practitioners early on to share our experience with other people who are now, this is new to them. Next slide, please. So that house that we showed earlier, that's the finished house in Newton. That's actually a net zero house with transportation, meaning that building is actually generating enough electricity to power both the house and their electric vehicles. So that house will never have a gas bill, an electric bill, and they probably won't have to pay for any fuel for their vehicles. So when builders talk about costs, a lot of times I encourage people to think of, yes, it costs the builder more upfront, but the cost that the savings that gets passed on to that homeowner over the 10 or 20 or 30 years, if you have no utility bill and no transportation bill, can really add up. So I think we have to redefine how we talk about cost in terms of upfront investment versus cost to the consumer. Next slide, please. We found out about high performance building. So I've been a member of the Builders and Remodelers Association of Boston for about 20 years. It's where I got my license. A former president of that organization once recommended that I join a Builder 20 club and said that was like the best thing he ever did for his company. And so through that, I reached out to NAHB and joined a Builder 20 club, which is really a peer review group where they partner you up with other builders from around the country and you go and visit each other and you sort of learn. And I was visiting with a builder, and one of the other builders was building Passive House in Iowa. And I thought, this is kind of cool. I'd like to get into this. And I was emailing with the project manager. And so we said, let's look into this. And so we reached out to the FIAS trainers course, and one of our PMs went down and took the course. And so our sort of introduction really was through the Builder Association, through some other builders who are practicing this in the Midwest. Next slide, please. And then we started really growing our skill as a company at Auburndale Builders through 2 local organizations. So, regional and local. I joined Passive House Massachusetts, but we did join FIAS. Sorry, Hank, I didn't put the Passive House Massachusetts slide on here. Passive House Massachusetts is the local chapter that sort of supports a lot of what FIAS is doing on the national level. and FIAS was sort of teaching the courses on how to be a high passive house builder. And we also joined NESI, which is the Northeast Sustainable Energy Association. And both of those groups have lots of practitioners who are sharing what they're learning while they're learning it. And there's a lot of lessons learned. So it's a pretty, it's an interesting community in that people are really trying to help each other learn how to build better and share from the mistakes that they're making and from what they're learning in the field. So Passive House Mass is the local group that Hank talked about. I used to be on the board there, and I would go to those monthly meetings. But FIAS is the national group that's really helping to try to push this on a broader level. So these are two great organizations. If you want more information, you can reach out to me. Next slide, please. So when they were rolling out these codes, I was sort of, we were already practicing. We were sort of already building beyond the codes, and I was thinking, well, with these new energy codes, a lot of the builders aren't going to go for passive house. They're going to go for HERS 42 or 45. So we worked on a collaboration with the Northeast HERS Raters Alliance to develop what builders need to know. So in the next slide, you'll see a link. This is a course that I worked with. Andrew Popliarski is a HERS Rater, and Bob Riley is the Director of Construction for Habitat for Humanity of Cape Cod. Bob was building kind of really affordable single-family high-performance buildings like down the Cape for Habitat. And Andrew was doing the modeling. Their company was donating their time for the modeling. And so we did a multi-part series, which is sort of a good introduction for builders about, hey, what do you have to think about? What's different? And it was the first one we did. I think we'll probably do more, and it would be nice to have some hands-on versions of this. But if we go to the next slide, I'll just sort of highlight some of the things that we did in that course. So if you Google HERS 42, 45, it's one of the first things that'll come up. It's a free course now, no paywall. But what we really looked at is what's different in the approaches. So we looked at overview in session 1. In session 2, we looked at orientation, windows, doors, and PV. You can see sort of what we're covering in each of the sessions. But what was really interesting for me is that we used to really exceed the HERS scores with passive house. And now as the HERS scores get lower, the approach you have to take to beat the codes is very similar. And so if we go to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit what's different. So we talk about this as dialing in your target. So if you're not experienced in high performance building, we start with HERS or passive house with orientation, meaning which way is the building facing. Then we look at our windows and doors. Then we look at PV, solar options. We look at our mechanicals, our insulation. And in HERS, you look at appliances. So what we're really looking at is what are our available options to reach those, reach the new codes. And every job is slightly different. And you really have to change up your approach. What it used to be, I joke around that, builders used to call their HERS rater about a week before we went for a permit and say, hey, I need a HERS score. And then you go get your permit. You can't do that anymore. You really have to adjust your dials. It's really hard to adjust your orientation the week before you apply for your permit if you haven't considered it. So Bob Rowley did some really good case studies on how they start out with orientation and how you really have to think about your windows and doors much earlier in your process. So if we go to the next slide, this is just like an example of like one of the assemblies. This is like a passive house we built where, once the design is getting ready to go to permitting, you kind of want to know what your dials are. Now, this is a passive house. This isn't a HERS 42 model. It's just sort of a case study of what you can get into. Every job is different. As I said, you might have really good southern orientation. You might have a lot of glazing, but it's facing the wrong way because you're trying to look at a certain view. And so you might have to dial up another assembly to meet your HERS number. So, this is a house with a very thick walls. This is an R44 wall. This is a thick roof. This is an R60 roof. This has like a high performance triple glazed windows. So, every assembly is, every house is going to be different. What I tell people now is really just contact that HERS rater very early in your design. As soon as you can get your HERS rater on your team, do that. If your architect doesn't have a good HERS rater, reach out to any HERS and they'll connect you with one. Take next slide, please. And yeah, this is like on this house, that assembly I showed you, we're doing a 2x6 wall, and we use a lot of reclaimed foam on our jobs. So that's it's 2 layers of reclaimed foam with a layer of zip on the outside. And that for us was when we're dialing in high performance, we're always looking at like, what is the cost? What is the performance? And then what is like the embodied carbon? That's how we kind of look at it. And we use a lot of reclaimed foam, which is coming from commercial buildings that have been taken apart. And we use this on a lot of our buildings now from a foam supplier. And so that's a way for us to sort of exceed the code. We can, we're getting a really high R value in that wall assembly. We're doing, and it's not that complicated for the carpenters to install it. They're really just building that frame like they normally would with 2x6 and CDX. And then we're adding 2 layers of foam with plywood again on the outside with zip tape. So, every builder is going to have to find that sweet spot between cost and performance. But that's where you really got to get that HERS rater on board early to know which way you're turning those dials. Next slide, please. That's that's a passive house we built out in Weston. That's kind of what it looks like after that foam is added on. And yeah, so we're trying to find assemblies that are really familiar to what carpenters already do, and then just adding layers that they can understand, and it doesn't have to get super complicated with how you achieve this. Next slide, please. So, this is our recommended workflow from that HERS 4245 course. So what we're going to recommend is more check-ins. So in schematic design or your design development or your CD design phases, check in with your HERS rater and your architect about what those assemblies are going to be. Don't wait till you're going for your permit. It's going to be really cost ineffective to turn those dials late in the game. And keep your value engineering options open. So don't design your team into a corner, right? So if you don't think about orientation and then you start trying to dial up you might have to go to a really thick roof or a really high performance window because you didn't get your orientation, your glazing right. And then focus on that high efficiency cooling systems. If you're not familiar with those systems, they're becoming more and more common. More and more HVAC contractors know how to use these heat pump systems. And so if you look at that stuff, if you look at your orientation, your windows and your mechanicals early, those are going to have your biggest impact on your HERS score. And then if you get those things right, then you can play with your assemblies and you can figure out which assembly works best for your trade contractors. So, once you figured out your formula, what Bob Riley shows with the Habitat is once they get their formula, then they repeat it and then they just crank that out. So like, Auburn Hills, we've got a few formulas now our crews like. You got to find that assembly that your crew likes, and then you can repeat it. And you sort of, like Hank showed in the multifamily, your first time through might cost you a little more. And then as you work through it, you're going to get more and more efficient at it, and you get better pricing from your trades because they're familiar with the practices at that point. Next slide, please. So as we've been learning, we've been trying to share what we're learning, and we formed a nonprofit that is now its own 501(c), and we created our hands-on course. A lot of trade contractors don't learn by sitting on Zoom calls, and so we created some hands-on assemblies that try to simulate the job site. So we do mock-ups, we work with the plans. We're really trying to simulate what are the skills you're going to need when you go back to the job site on Monday morning to apply the techniques and the questions. And so if people are interested, we're going to be running that course probably 4 times over the next winter, and we'll be working with the Builders Association and with HERS and with Passive House Massachusetts to keep developing new content that'll meet tradespeople where they're at. So our real goal is to train trainers that can go run these programs out on the sites with trade contractors. Next slide, please. So this is just a picture of like we do some renderings of different wall assemblies, and then the carpenters work as teams evaluating the assemblies, talking through the options, and then actually building it. And we've had a few architects take the class too, and the architects are even sort of saying, oh, it's like an aha moment where they're like, oh, I designed that. Oh, that's what that means when they have to build it. So hopefully we'll be creating more hands-on courses and training facilitators through the Builders Association and through other vocational school instructors to run these classes around the state. That's our goal. I think that's it for my slide, Sean. I don't know if I had any other ones. So, oh yeah, just a summary, same thing Hank said. What are there's the benefits? It's lower operating costs for the homeowners and the renters. So a net zero all electric house means they have no gas or electric bill for the life of the building. A net positive building makes more electricity than it uses, and that can power your vehicles. Better indoor air quality, better thermal comfort, and better resale value on the marketplace, right? This is like Hank said, this is a better asset. This is increasingly becoming valued on the marketplace as consumers become more aware of these units. So when people talk about cost, yes, it can cost you more to build it, but you can sell it for more. and it can hold its value longer. So if you take a look at the next slide, I like to show this one. The proof is in the pudding. This is our office. It's a net positive building. If you look closely, the electrical company owes us $6,800, meaning we're powering our vehicles. Our guys are starting to power up the EVs at the office. They are paying us to do it. Yes, it cost us money to put that in there, but a net positive building is, the builder's not getting the benefit from that, even though we are the builder. But if you're the homeowner and you can get a net zero or net positive, your house can be a little power plant that generates solar income for you. So, I think we just need to, when I hear people saying it's going to cost more, yes, and let's broaden the discussion to 10 years out, 20 years out, what is that going to look like? So that's all I've got for my slides. Thank you, Sean.
All right. Thank you, Nick. So really appreciate all the panelists' presentations tonight. That brings us to the Q&A segment, which I know we're at 8:02 now, so we're planning to stick around till 8:30. So we'll just open it up. I did get a chat earlier on that the Q&A feature is currently disabled. I've since enabled it, but if you have any issues, feel free to just chat to the host and panelists, and we can pull out questions that way. With that being said, does anyone have any questions to start about, anything that was presented tonight? And also jump back. I'm also going to actually just go back earlier. When we were going through the slides, I think people on Zoom may not have seen this slide of a lot of slides that we went through tonight. So let's see here. I think this is a good summary of the specialized code. This was one slide that wasn't picked up in the Zoom recording. So just to kind of highlight some of the key elements of the specialized code. I think that's important. I see we also got a question here. So while that's up, we got a question online. Are the passive house incentives only for new construction, or do they apply to renovations to existing buildings as well? Anybody want to take that on the team?
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, essentially they're for new construction. I've run into some projects where they're mixed. Some of it's rehab, some of it's new. And under the Mass Save incentives, I've seen them be flexible and be able to wrap in the rehab portion of the building. But generally speaking, they are for new construction.
Sometimes, and depending on the level of renovation, Mass Save might consider it as a new construction, which actually has different thresholds than what the stretch code has. But if it's substantial work to the building, then Mass Save might treat it as a new construction.
Right.
I think one question that I hear about too, so obviously there's no additional EV wiring requirements. I was wondering if, just to put that on the table, like what are the requirements under the stretch code now? Does anyone comment on this? Oh, Mike.
Yeah, so the requirements under the stretch code, I believe, are found in R. I have to check the specific control. Yeah, so for residential buildings, the requirements for EV charging are found in section R404.4. And 1 and 2 family dwellings and townhouses have to have at least one 50 amp branch circuit per dwelling unit to provide AC level 2 charging. And all other RUs buildings have to have at least 20% of spaces served with a 40 amp 208 240 volt circuit with a minimum capacity of 9.6 kVA. So those are the residential requirements for both 1 and 2 family dwellings and townhouses and all other RUs buildings. And there are a few exceptions as well. I can speak to those too if anyone has questions on that. But the requirements in the stretch code, if you want to look into it in more detail, section R404.
Great, thank you. We also got a question about slides. So yeah, we will be posting the slides after this meeting on the specialized code page. I'm actually just going to navigate back and show you. That was on the next slide. Right here. So yeah, just to highlight this, if you have any other questions, or you're just looking for general information or the recording of this meeting, you'll be able to see it on the Framingham website specialized code page, framinghamma.gov/specialized code. I also see a question from Nick in the chat to Fred about questions and concerns from builders.
Well, this has not been implemented as far as the opt-in code goes. So I have not experienced any feedback yet for that. So that remains to be seen. I don't like to forecast what might happen. I'll leave that for when it actually happens. But no, I have not been approached by anyone on this for future. For the future and when it might be implemented.
Thanks, Fred. All right, well, if there are no other questions, I think we could probably wrap up for tonight. I do want to thank again the panelists for coming for the presentations, much appreciated. And once again, we'll host everything on the city's website here. Let me just make sure I'm not forgetting anything over here. We had some supplemental slides.
They're mostly on the commercial side and on ADUs.
Okay,
Yeah, it's just miscellaneous information, but it's really pertinent to if anyone has any questions on that, but it's a mishmash of stuff.
okay. All right. Well, thank you all again. I'll be hanging out till 8:30. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to come up. But we really appreciate you coming down to learn about this, and hope as we move forward, we can stay in touch with updates, other new information that comes out. Thank you, guys. Appreciate it.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.